I think I was about 7 or 8 years old when my father took me and my brother down to a community pool in Yonkers, New York, where we lived. It was an older building and a typical rectangular pool, and he was concerned it's about time we learned how to swim. I remember being there. My first impression was this. It was an old pool, and I went out to see it. It looked nice, but the first place I went was stepping right over that pool where the deep part was. And looking down, it looked terrifyingly deep. It was probably 10 or 12 feet deep. And I said, I'm not swimming in that. I'm not going there. But after a few weeks, we had some swimming lessons, and we learned at least how to keep our head above the water. And by the time we did leave that pool, a few weeks later, I was swimming in the deep part and learned how to take that chance by going into the deep. Sometimes God does that for us. We don't want to go into the deep, and yet God tells us we need to do it, and it works out fine. In fact, that seems to be one of the themes that holds together the readings we heard read to us this evening. Isaiah was in the temple praying, and he had a terrifying vision. What he saw was the glories and power of God himself in heaven. And it was so overwhelming to his human form, he fell down in fear, thinking he was about to die. Because no human being in human form could certainly come into God's presence and live. Didn't happen. But nonetheless, he was given a vocation, given a mission by God and the angel, and he in turn left the temple and became one of the greatest Old Testament prophets. He went into that temple praying one day, had a plan just to pray, but God pulled him into the deep, doing something he never imagined he would do or ever want to do, and did it well. Second reading, we have St. Paul, who was a leading Pharisee of his day, one of the most brilliant and enthusiastic teachers of Judaism, taught by one of the great teachers of the day, Gamaliel. And I suspect he was being groomed to be one of the head Pharisees in Jerusalem, in that holy place. Then he was told of a problem. In Damascus, there was a new small heresy growing up, which was taking hold in Judaism and breaking things up, making people uncomfortable, and causing trouble, called Christianity. And his plan was to follow God's law and to go up and arrest people in Damascus and stop this heresy from spreading, to do God's will, and to make sure the law is not tainted in any way. So he goes, and on the way he's stopped short by a brilliant light. It's so brilliant, it throws him off the horse. He falls on the ground. He's blinded, and he hears a voice. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And because of that instant, which probably lasts 3 to 4 minutes, his life changed forever. And his plan of going up and arresting Christians in Damascus was completely thrown out, and he was fearful because God changed his plan and he was thrown into the deep. His life completely changed in a way which he never expected, didn't want, and was fearful of doing. Then in the gospel, we have something similar to the first two instances with St. Peter, who was called Simon at the time. He was a fisherman in what I would call a lower middle class, small village on the Sea of Gennesaret called Capernaum. I remember visiting the place about 5 or 6 years ago. And he knew, with his partners and the people he worked with, about fishing in that large lake. I think, if I remember correctly, it's about 14 miles long by about 7 miles. It's a good-sized lake. But he went out there half the morning, half the day, part of the night, and caught nothing. Then he came in, washed his gear, cleaned out the boat, put the nets away, sent his employees home, and listened to Jesus preach. Then, when Jesus was finished, he said, "Simon, come, get to the boat with me, get your gear ready. We're going fishing." I'm sure when he heard that, he did more than probably roll his eyes just a few times. He has to call his employees back, get the boat ready, take out the nets just been cleaned, get the bait, etc., etc. It's a lot of work. But he did it begrudgingly. He said, "Lord, this is what you want. Okay, but I'll warn you, we've been out all night and we have caught nothing. You're wasting our time." They went out with 2 boats. And within a brief, short minutes, 2 boats pulled in nets loaded with fish. The Lord certainly pulled Peter into the deep. When he said that, more deepening things were going to happen. And they came back on the shore, put the fish away, and the experience was so amazing to them, they dropped what they were doing and followed Jesus, of course, as his apostles. I think all of us, without exception, at one time or another in our lives, the Lord asks us to go into the deep. And it's scary. Every time during the summer, we read in the Cape Cod Times the problems we have on Cape Cod beaches in Wellfleet, Truro, Orleans, Chatham. The Atlantic Ocean, beautiful beaches, and people are afraid to go into the deep. Go out. Why? Yep. No one wants to be made a midday dinner by a great white. It's scary going out into the deep. It's unknown. It's uncontrollable. We can't see. We don't know what's going to happen. And yet God at times asks us to do exactly that, like he did with Isaiah, like he did with St. Paul, and like he did with Simon and the rest of his apostles. To put all plan aside and to follow his. Now that's so easy to say and so hard to do. To put our plan aside, thinking it's the right one, it's going to work, I know what I'm doing, and suddenly God puts you in a situation where you have to throw all that out. Only a person of faith and trust in God can do that. Sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't. Because our trust and faith, perhaps, is not deep enough to go out into the deep and trust. But the time will come, if it hasn't already, where all of us are going to have to throw our plans to the wind and trust in God's when he asks us to go into the deep.